To have you for the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, Grassroots Liberation School, Black Studies Summer School. We're very happy to have you all here today. My name is Jamil. My pronouns are he and him. And I am the organizer at large with the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. The Malcolm X Grassroots Movement is an organization of Black New African people who believe in our right to self-determination, self-defense, and self-respect. We situate ourselves in a long legacy of revolutionary struggle for the liberation of our people, and we organize in 8 chapters across the country around our 6 principles of unity, which include we defend the human rights of all African people, we demand reparations, we promote self-determination, we oppose genocide, we demand the release of all of our political prisoners, prisoners of war, and political exile. And our 6th principle is that we struggle to end gender and sexual oppression. If you haven't yet, please rename yourselves in the chat box with your name and your pronouns. So we also have 7 aspects of the MXGM personality. And these 7 aspects include, and we just want to remind you all of our community engagement and how we proceed in summer school. Number one, always be humble when dealing with African people. You can be humble and firm at the same time. Number two, respect the actions and customs of others. Number three, never engage in petty, senseless arguments. Also, number four, do not go places looking for arguments, ideological or otherwise. Number five, never be afraid to wage ideological struggle or ask difficult questions if necessary to establish political clarity. Number six, never talk just to be seen or heard. Remember, we keep us safe, so we need to abide by all of these community agreements and these aspects of MXGM's personality. And we will maintain these with our digital security team. So, and last but not least, always practice self-criticism in moving with our engagements. So we have 7 commandments of umoja, and also keep this in mind and also embody this as students in the Grassroots Liberation School. We're all students here today, and always keep that in mind. So number one, aid each other. Two, be positive. Three, be patient. Four, be honest. Five, show courage. Six, listen as much as you talk. And number seven, always remember to be programmatic. So today we have reached the moment we've all been waiting for quite some time. Dr. Chrystel Oloukoï is an artist, film critic, and curator exploring imaginations of the night, nocturnal environments, Black ecologies, and their afterlives of colonial technologies of temporal discipline. They hold a PhD in African and African American studies from Harvard University with a second field in critical media practice and currently work at the University of Washington as an assistant professor of geography. And I present to you Dr. Chrystel Oloukoï.
Thank you, Jamil. Let me share my screen.
Are you able to show it? Oh, there you go.
Yes, can everyone see it? Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction and also for the very kind invitation to speak here as part of the Black Studies summer lectures. I wanted to thank MGMX Philly, but also my dear friend Zalika for inviting me to give this lecture. And I also wanted to flag that those are preliminary reflections on a topic that I've been ranting about a lot to Zalika. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to sit with thoughts that have been at the back of my mind for quite some time. So some of you may have recognized the inspiration for the title of this talk, What is this global in global Black studies, which is coming from which is indebted to two essays by Jamaican-British theorist Stuart Hall, Race, Articulation, and Society Structured in Dominance, but also and primarily, what is this Black in Black popular culture? I initially envisioned this lecture in four parts. First, stowaways, globetrotters, and extraterritorial Blackness, or some context for this inquiry. Second, global Black studies, methodological nationalisms, and other distractions. Third, global meltdowns, what do diaspora wars have to do with this? And last, counter-genealogies of the global, the Black world, and the West as a project. And because I'm very delusional, I had to come to terms with the fact that I only have time for one segment of those, which is global Black studies, methodological nationalisms, and other distractions. But I can speak more about some of those other ideas in our Q&A. So let me start with a thesis that is also a paradox. The global in global Black studies seems to signal an emancipation from national frames, and yet both enabled and domesticated by the imperial nature of the US academy, it mostly materializes as a liberal project of diversity inclusion into nation states. At its worst, Global Black Studies is no more than an inventory project that aims to catalog flavors of Black life across the globe at the expense of a global analysis of interlinkages and articulations between Black diasporas. At its best, however, Global Black Studies is also a symptom of and a response to the domestic capture of Black studies within the containers of a particular imperial nation state, which is the United States. That is, at its best, Global Black Studies attempts to resurrect the original mission of Black studies, which is that of an inquiry into the Black world. Okay, so that's a lot. And I hope I'm able to unpack all of these in the next 40 minutes or so, but please write down your questions as they come somewhere for yourselves or in the chat, so as to not lose track of them, and we can go back to them in the conversations. But starting with a quick summary of what I'm seeing as an emergent institutionalization of a new label in Black studies, which is global Black studies. And those of us trained in or familiar with Black studies know that there are very important politics of naming within those multiple labels. So I'm not sure when exactly Purchase SUNY Global Black Studies program is established, except for the fact that it is prior to 2007, because it's recensed in Al-Kalimat 2007, publication of that year. But in that publication, it is the only program/department who is bearing that label of Global Black Studies and functions as an outlier of sorts. We have, of course, many other names: Africana Studies, African American Studies, Black Studies, Pan-African Studies, African and African American Studies, Africology, etc. So Global Black Studies, in many ways, is a more recent phenomenon, except, again, for Purchase SUNY, and I would love to dig more into when and why that bifurcation happened there. Most departments, centers, programs using the Global Black Studies label pivoted to it in the 2020s, or were established then. So here you have an emerging attempt at cataloging. Undeniably, at the center of the proliferation of the global Black studies paradigm in the form of programs, centers, special issues, working groups, fellowships, faculty positions, etc., is the movement for Black lives. We can see like a lot of this start around 2020. In the aftermath of the death of George Floyd and the many other movements it inspired globally across the diaspora and the continent. Both domestically within the United States, but also globally, this movement was accompanied by pacification campaigns in the form of funding opportunities aimed at stabilizing a reformist element hungry for absorption. And of course, that's not the entire story, and many still dream of quote unquote stealing from a university and undercommons with varying degrees of naivete, shrewdness, and strategy. But looking at the tech, special issues, websites, job searches, open calls, one must ask, how those global Black studies differ from Black studies. At a rhetorical level, we can and must name the seduction of the analytic of the global. And we must recognize this analytic of the global precisely because of the seduction that it inspires and suggests as one of those North Atlantic universals that Asian scholar Mitchell Rolfe Trujillo warned us about. That is, concepts that both prescribe and seduce because they hide the affect they project behind a claim of rationality. Looking at modernity or the international community as some of those North Atlantic universals, Trujillo notes, it makes sense to be modern. It is good to be modern. How could anyone not want to be modern? Similarly, how could anyone not want to join the international community? I would add, similarly, who would not want to be global in a globalized world in which the aptitude to flex one's belonging to multiple overlapping scales and geographies marks one as either of the times or backward? And yet, this is precisely why these are North Atlantic universals. Only very specific types of differences and our global linkages are recognized as postmodern or global. Stuart Hall recognized the Western ethnocentrism of the North Atlantic universal just as much as Trujillo, when he called postmodernism not a new cultural epoch, but merely modernism in the streets. He adds with a lot of sarcasm, the only places where one can genuinely experience the postmodern ethnic cuisine are Manhattan and London, not Calcutta. For the same reason, I would add, instance, do not mark you as interracial nearly as much as white plus. I pause intentionally here on the white plus as a formulation of the relationship between modernism and postmodernism, between the primitive element invisibilized, delegitimized, but still absorbed, still used, still foundational, and the primitive element adorned, spectacularized, commodified. Trujillo goes further when he reminds us of the profound histories of movement we inherit far beyond Euro-American periodizations of the global in the late 1980s. Indeed, I forgot to add this quote. It's fine. I'll just read it. Indeed, the particularity of the dominant narratives of globalization is a massive silencing of the past on a world scale. The systemic erasure of continuous and deep-felt encounters that have marked human history throughout the globe and that I have only sketched here. For sushi in Chicago to amaze us, we need to silence the fact that the Franciscans were in Japan as early as the 15th century. For Muslim veils in France to seem out of place, we need to forget that Charles Martel stopped Abd al-Rahman only 300 miles south of Paris, 2 reigns before Charlemagne. To talk of a global culture today as a new phenomenon, we need to forget that Chinese chili paste comes from Mexico, French fries from Peru, and Jamaican Blue Mountain coffee from Yemen. Perhaps. I don't think either that any kind of large-scale, long-distance trade, conquest, or travels equals globalization. And elsewhere, Trujillo is much more rigorous in distinguishing between those long-distance, large-scale phenomenon and encounters and the first systemic, massive movement of population from the slave trade onwards to the various refugee crises in the present that characterize the global production of inequality in a racial capitalist world system. So, returning to the global in global Black studies, there is definitely an element of funding or marketing strategy in the brands of the term, but I wanted to start with Trujillo and Robinson to also emphasize that there's also an element of desire and an affect. What global adds to Black studies is not, I would argue, a geographical expansion because Black studies has always been concerned with the world in its entirety, necessarily so, because Blackness cannot afford not to be concerned with the world. What it adds, however, is a seduction, which is also a domestication within geographies of management and geographies of imagination that posits the global or the globe as a neat arrangement of national spheres in which idiosyncratic experiences of Blackness must be discovered away from the homogenizing dominant US-based definition of it. What disappears from the map in naming this desire for a specific imagination of the global is power. And I must say, even if I don't have time to expand on this, that calls for an international community in the face of the horrific nature of what is happening in Gaza are part of that very same lure of the North Atlantic universals, the global, the nation state, the international community. All of these hide the continuation of an older system of rule, which is empire. And one does not dismantle empire with please. So Wayne University's Black Studies Center, hard earned in the 1970s from student protests, like most Black Studies units in the United States, became Africana Studies in 1989, as it got departmentalized before renaming itself African American Studies in 2015. In 2020, it received a $6 million Mellon grant to create a Detroit Center for Black Studies with a multi-year cluster hire of 50 tenured or tenure-track faculty over a 3-year period, and then pivoting to the global. Global isn't in the title, but it is everywhere in the communications from that date forward as a haunting appendage to the project of Black Studies. This seems to signal another moment of expansion. After a brief phase of contraction, from Black Studies to Africana to African American, back to Black Studies. Back to. My wording here is deceptive. As part of the argument is the incommensurability between the beginning and the end. The labor that the analytic of the global does appended to the project of Black Studies. Another example and a similar move is also the Clemson Pan-African Studies program, which renamed itself Global Black Studies in 2022. So one recurring rhetoric in the text produced by the global blackness paradigm within and outside of the United States is a desire to understand blackness beyond the United States. One must understand then the global as a synonym for not the United States or everything but the United States. And let me be clear that there is nothing wrong about the desire for Black studies to have a geographical range that is not confined to the United States. I would say that it is actually congruent with what the mission of Black studies has always been. What should raise our suspicion, however, is that geographical expansion beyond the US becomes somehow coterminous with the global. And I've struggled a bit to name what's happening, and I remain a bit unsatisfied with the formulation I ended up with, which is that there are two processes at stake here. An attempt to disarticulate Black studies from the experience of slavery in the Americas, but also, and perhaps more abundantly, also an attempt to subordinate such experiences, that is a triangular trade, which has remade the contour of the world, to the contours of the United States. Going back to Trujillo again, in Silencing the Past, is talking about teaching this class called The Black Experience in the Americas, and about his students' reactions to that class. And he states, in particular, I wanted them to know that slavery did not happen only in Georgia and Mississippi. I wanted them to learn that the African connection was more complex and tortuous than they had ever imagined, that the US monopoly on both blackness and racism was itself a racist plot. And to understand that racist plot, one must understand the moment of the independencies, the coming into being of the post-colony, or more accurately, the neo-colony, the national moment, as a gigantic enterprise of unknowing, of racial forgetting that dooms specific geographies under the label of the global to the unending task of constantly discovering lost or unknown territories of blackness elsewhere. So I'm often frustrated by the very reductive ways in which people talk about the imperial core versus its peripheries as two unassimilable geographies or destinies, as if they're not made of multiple crossings. But it is important to recognize that there are positions that could be gained in the imperial core in relation to Black studies that were foreclosed in the corners of empire, and vice versa. Also, those gains are not once and for all, and we also know how precarious Black studies remain even in the imperial core. But precarious or not, it is also a precious space where one can produce knowledge about themselves, a promise, if not a realization. And I insist on if not a realization. A promise, if not a realization, of epistemic sovereignty. The seeds of such project of epistemic sovereignty with radical interdisciplinary research institutes also existed in the post-colony of the 1960s, 1970s, for instance, at the University of the West Indies, at the Makerere Institute for Social Research, or at the University of Dar es Salaam, to name a few. We must relentlessly ask what happened to Black studies there. While banned from Jamaica, Walter Rodney found refuge at the University of Dar es Salaam from 1969 to 1974 with the university students' African Revolutionary Front. The campus at that time of Dar es Salaam functioned as a site of Black study and African liberation hub, two things that are not completely overlapping, bringing on its grounds Black intellectuals from all over the Americas, the Caribbean, Europe, and the continent, like C.L.R. James, Kwame Ture, Chedi Jagan, members of the neighboring Liberation Front of Mozambique, Frelimo, and also members of the paramilitary wing of the South African National Congress, Umkhonto we Sizwe. This is not an accident that Julius Nyerere, at the time president of Tanzania, is one of the essayists of the Atlanta-based Institute of the Black World's 1974 anthology, Education and Black Struggle, Notes from the Colonized World. I insist on those alternative geographies of Black study precisely to underscore how much of the history we inherit of Black studies has been a sanitized national bound history, even if the names that form its canon are anything but nation-bound, but born out of those promiscuous and conflict-laden spaces of encounter and interface, and also gathered in many ways in the US Imperial Academy. And I also want to note that I particularly appreciate two scholars who do that work, this labor of relentlessly insisting on this fact. Dutch Myers of Black Study, but also Brent Edwards earlier in the practice of diaspora. But they do this work specifically for the Caribbean and for Europe. And I focus here on Dar es Salaam to also rewrite the African continent as part and parcel of those intellectual exchanges and not just an imagined aspirational geography of return. So I guess my main argument here is that at the same time as Black studies is institutionalized in the imperial core, similar seeds of epistemic sovereignty have already been squashed or are in the process of being squashed at its peripheries by two things. First, the reorganization of imperial science in the Cold War with the formation of area studies, African studies being one of those. But also, second, nation states eager to harness knowledge production to the needs of the nation state in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and on the African continent in the form of development studies. We can have a whole other conversation about the perils of institutionalization, but it's still different from the enforced disappearance of any body of knowledge dedicated to the critical study of race, and specifically Blackness, in the corners of empire. Eric Williams, historian and famed author of Capitalism and Slavery, but also Prime Minister of Trinidad between 1962 and 1981, persecuted Black studies on the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies, which he had himself championed prior, accusing the new discipline of creating in Jamaica a national divide between Afro-descendants and Indian heritage, not conducive to the formation of a national identity. And Fanon, C.L.R. James, and also Sylvia Robinson, and many others have discussed the kind of contradiction of the national bourgeoisies and the trappings of this desire for a national identity. This is the promise of the nation state at work as a technology of racial forgetting or denial in its pursuit of a national identity, even as the material conditions of racial stratification of empire still persist. I just want to say in passing that the second obstacle, aside from nationalist politics, that ended up also kind of like thwarting the development of Black studies at UWI, as narrated by Fitzroy and Ray Baptiste, was also the, aside from nationalist politics, was also the Department of History, which, to quote Baptiste, set out to absorb, if not kill, Black studies. And I hope you heard that last part and that you think about some of the dynamics affecting Black studies today in relation to traditional disciplines, but specifically in relation to history, as most Black studies programs hire disciplinary trained personnel specializing in Black stuff within disciplinary lanes instead of Black studies scholars. And history is historically the science of the nation state par excellence. Okay, before I go on a rant about history and not about global Black studies, let me go back to my point. Eric Williams is one example among many, and I mentioned earlier Rodney finding refuge on the campus of the University of Dar es Salaam. That refuge or respite is very short-lived. His critique of the nation state, again, we go back to that question of the nation state, both in Tanzania and in Jamaica and in many other parts. His critique of the nation state as a conduit for white capital that is neocolonialism is met by Julius Nyerere with anger, and it ends up banning the University Students African Revolutionary Front and also severely constraining Rodney's academic freedom. I hate this term academic freedom, but I have nothing else coming to mind right now. And the reason why the African Students Revolutionary Front is banned at the time is for promoting foreign ideology. And I'm really fascinated by this word foreign and its relation with the category of Blackness, explicit or implicit. And I would say that it is the same logic which earlier in 1952 leads the US State Department to revoke W.E.B. Du Bois' passport. Black studies is at its most dangerous in those spaces of articulation between different yet interconnected registers of Blackness, whose geographies do not map easily onto nation-state cartographies. What made the Institute of the Black World dangerous was not that it was in Atlanta, but that it connected Black liberation struggles in Atlanta to Black liberation struggles in Mozambique, Haiti, etc. Similarly, what made the University of Dar es Salaam equally dangerous was not that it was in Dar es Salaam, but again, those connections, those articulations, to go back to Stuart Hall, which were not without friction, and we can talk more about those, but which were also real attempts to understand interlinked systems of racialization. What we inherit with Black studies are histories of uncontained movement against all odds, against states of captivity which took and still take many, many forms. What makes global Blackness extremely tame, to me, is that it is a project of difference for the sake of difference in many cases, and I'll come back to this, not of articulation. An optimist might say that description, the catalog of the inventory, might be a stage prior to articulation, a kind of first stage in some ways. I'm not that optimistic, even if I would be glad in this instance to be proven wrong. So description, the act of taking stock, of claiming existence, is also part of the project of Black studies. I'm not saying it's not part of it, but it cannot be all of it. And again, it is a project that is traversed by multiple antagonisms and contradictory desires. For Cedric Robinson, for instance, the purpose of Black studies is a critique of Western civilization. For others, critique cannot be the end goal. There must be some sort of affirmative element. And Hare tries to hold those tensions together as he names a dual dimension to the Black studies program, both expressive, which is an analogon to that affirmative element, giving expression to erased, invisibilized culture, knowledges, ways of life, but also a pragmatic dimension. And we might disagree on what the pragmatics are, but they must exist. There is, after all, nothing inherently revolutionary about making Black people into objects of study, even when the gaze is Black. Hare notes, echoing Robinson, 4 major white universities this year received $1 million from the Ford Foundation alone to study the Negro. We believe that they have been studying the wrong man. We want $10 million from Ford to study the white man. The expressive can also be a pragmatics with Sylvia Winter, who reminds us, as she states, of a different kind of vocation for the Black scholar in the academy. How can we marry our thoughts so that we can now pose the questions whose answers can resolve the plight of the jobless archipelagos, the non-human involved categories, and the environment? Questions whose answers can resolve the plight. The task at hand, she writes, is to undo their narratively condemned status. And that's, I would say, the vocation I resonate the most with as someone trained in Black studies. So what I'm naming under the sign of the catalog or the inventory is a recent dominant trend which does not, I would say, exhaust the entire project of global Black studies in relation to Black studies. And I don't really care for labels, like people do a lot of things under those different labels. And I would say that global Black studies can definitely be made into something else and can be made dangerous. But the global needs to stop naming beyond the United States or everything else but the United States. That is separation, exclusion, autonomous histories, as if one can ever escape the reach of empire, and start naming connections, interlinkages, translocal assemblages. That is a recognition that every local place, including within the imperial core, but especially there, is a product of local and global forces. And this is already happening. So there are a few exceptions that I also want to highlight, which is, for instance, the University of Miami's Center for Global Black Studies, which states explicitly that the point is to understand the world from Miami as a global location, uniquely situated between the US South and the global South. Global here is not disconnected from place or looking at multiple places for the sake of it, but the global as in translocal, looking at how places are connected. This is when global does not mean beyond the United States, but beyond national geographies of knowledge. That is beyond methodological nationalism. And that includes also the methodological nationalism that drives a lot of research on the United States. The naturalization of the nation state as a container of or for race hides the imperial scale, that is, interconnected processes of racialization that both use the national scale but also bypass it from above and below and produce something akin to a global stage. I also want to cite one of my favorite journals, which is Southern Cultures, and their definition, the way they talk about the South as from Faulkner in Bulgaria to Lebanese in Mississippi, and from teaching Gone with the Wind in Vietnam to the international avant-garde at Black Mountain, we recognize that no border can contain our complex region. So where does that leave us? Global Black Studies is a contradictory project. At its best, at its most dangerous, it mobilizes Blackness as a critical lens to reflect on the production of the global as a category of rule, domination, subjugation. The Global Blackness Working Group at the University of the West Indies and at Duke invokes as an object of study an attentiveness to the global production of states of unfreedoms that stitch together life on a planet. At its worst, however, Global Black Studies emerge as a project of assimilation that aims at proving the existence of and cataloging Black communities beyond the US, the way colonial scientific expedition ships roam the globe, their bellies full of pinned flora and fauna. This is what I name the taxidermist or ornithologist impulse. And I'm using those categories that we've come to associate with the natural sciences and evolutionary biology in the 18th century on purpose. Ornithologist of culture, ornithologist of Black culture specifically, because the distance between race and culture as a way to essentialize or naturalize difference beyond history, beyond a critical mapping of relations of power, is not as far as one might imagine. Ask African studies, for instance. So the problem of the inventory is a problem of description whose purpose is nothing else than making statements of existence. is that there is also no amount of proof that will be enough to counter the bad faith mechanism of racial forgetting, because it is entangled in the nation state as a technology overall. Ultimately, the destiny of the inventory without purpose is a project of enumeration, cataloging the different registers of blackness that exist across the globe as a beautiful, colorful, and ultimately non-threatening panoply. And it is funny, and by funny I mean extremely sad, that these technologies of racial forgetting that have Black people all over the world embrace xenophobic particularisms, not singularities, particularisms, happen at the very same time as white supremacy shows us more blatantly than ever in the figure of the white settler refugee in the United States, in South Africa, in Australia, in the UK, or in Israel, that settler solidarities themselves have no national boundaries. And this is not a new phenomenon. And I don't have time for this, but we can talk at some point about the Carnegie Commission, the New York-based Carnegie Commission report of 1929, and its relationship between both the New Deal in the Americas, in the United States, and the consolidation of apartheid in South Africa to rescue and secure the white power in both settler colonies. So as this lecture comes to a close, allow me a detour by the social sciences or Western knowledge production to highlight what I think is a particularity of the object of Black studies and what is at stake in its domestication. We consider the world to be a purview, writes Darlene Clark Hines in the Black Studies Manifesto. Taking the world at once purview, or Western civilization, or the Black world, multiple terms that name different, expansive aspects of Black studies, an aspect of its combative nature, not just descriptive nature, is infringing on the terms of order of the US Imperial Academy and its European sisters with their trademark territories of epistemic ownership. So my approach to the social sciences is incredibly indebted to a scholar that not enough people read, which is South African scholar Archie Mafeje, and his refusal to separate bourgeois social sciences at home and abroad, as well as Zine Magubane's analysis of the common skies and divided horizons of anthropology and sociology, whereby, she writes, the closure provided by the nation state masks how American sociologists constructed the Negro problem at home as a domestic continuum of an imperial native question on the continent. And we can also think here about Jimmy Mapierre's work on nativization as racialization in Ghana, but in the colonies in general. So in his landmark article, The Problem of Anthropology in Historical Perspective, an inquiry into the growth of the social sciences, Archie Mafeje states, the problem of anthropology, which he identifies as a positivism and functionalism that is heir to the Enlightenment, actually straddles the social sciences as a whole. Naming explicitly sociology, history, political science, and economy as not only no less imperialistic, but also as rationalizations for neocolonialism in Africa. That is, as anthropology in another guise. There can be no disciplines within Marxism, writes Mafeje, reflecting on the ideological functions of separation as a kind of Taylorism applied to knowledge production, which also anticipates much contemporary work in critical abolitionist university studies. In another register is also the Gulbenkian Commission's report on the social sciences, which is chaired by world system theorist Immanuel Wallerstein, but which also include, amongst other members, Cameroonian scholar Valentin Yves Mudimbe and Haitian scholar Michel Rolf Trio. And the purpose of that commission was to provide an account of the rise of the disciplines, especially the social sciences, here identified in a similar fashion as in Mafeje, as history, economics, sociology, political science, and anthropology. And provide an account of that rise of the social sciences, of the disciplines, in terms of a political economy of knowledge production in the context of state formation. They write, among other things, social science was very much a creature, if not a creation, of the states, taking their boundaries as crucial social containers. They also offer a very, like one of the most lucid analysis that I've seen of the Cold War era reorganization of those social sciences and humanities within what became the imperial discipline of area studies. So Black studies domesticated by the nation state, that is Black studies as a region within American ethnic studies, is also a domestic counterpart to area studies, which is African studies, among other area studies. At home and abroad, the function is governance. What can you do with a degree in Black studies or in Africana studies? More than a few Black studies departments today answer this question with law enforcement, either directly on their careers page, and I'm not kidding, if you dig a bit, you will find it. I won't name names here, or indirectly in course offerings, internships, and partnerships. Development studies and the COPS are two interrelated arms of the technology of governance we've come to know as a nation state, two related forms of capture that threaten the project of Black studies. In other words, disciplining within academic disciplines and domestication within the geographies of the nation states are also two sides of a similar coin. And that's what Vincent Harding articulates in this very long quote, but that I think we should still, even if I'm almost out of time, I think we should still read it because it's very important, which is in the same way that we break beyond false boundaries of Western colonialism, attempting to recreate our essential Pan-African unity, expressing our solidarity with the larger pro-human struggles, so too our truth demands that we reject the artificial barriers of the academic disciplines to seek the human unity which underlies the experience of our people. Just as the best of the anti-colonial revolutionary leaders reject the national, political, economic, and social systems created by the colonizers, so do we deny a priori validity of methodological disciplines, concepts, and fields, which have been established without our participation, and which have often worked against the best intellectual and political interest of the African people. Anthropology, African studies, and Western civilization are only among the more obvious. I would add here history. Here again, examples abound of Black scholars who have acted out this element of the struggle in their own lives, who have moved continuously beyond and sometimes against the disciplines assigned to them by the university. Instead, they have allowed the experience of our people to become the organizing. So here I think Harding articulates what makes Black studies dangerous, which is this vocation to have the contours of one's object, the methodological principles of one's inquiry, be dictated by the experience of our people as an organizing reality. This is a type of knowledge production that happens when, to paraphrase Barbara Christian, the imperative is literally to save one's life, not professional advancement. The question is, always was, here to paraphrase Tony Cade Bambara, how do we rescue the planet from the psychopaths? Within the Cold War landscape we inherit of area studies and American ethnic studies, Black studies is one of the rare fields that not only straddles, but also disallows the divide and the doubling geographies of both the nation state and the imperial core periphery, as well as the divide of the disciplines. If the subject of Black studies is Black states of infreedom across the world, it invades the guarded academic territories or monopolies of the sociologists at home and the anthropologists abroad, of American ethnic studies and African studies all at once. It is a kind of scholarship that leads the State Department to label one an American, not the kind of scholarship that tries to present Black survival as, quote unquote, perfecting the American project of democracy. I think, yeah. Why would one ever want to perfect a genocidal project? This is a type of scholarship also that leads nation states all over the world, in Tanzania, in Jamaica, etc., to label one's work foreign ideology. Because yes, there is nothing more foreign to the nation state and its essentialisms and states of servitude than the articulation of Black freedom. End to end, maybe, just maybe, some corners of the empire would not have to rediscover every 6 months that their own state is trying to kill them if they knew they own no such thing as a state. If they knew that they are Black rather than Nigerian, Kenyan, Tanzanian, hell, even French or American. If they did not succumb to the nation state of the illusion of an international community as an instrument of racial forgetting, as a way to hide empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Oloukoï, for that awesome lecture. We really enjoyed it, and I look forward to all of the discussions and questions we have. So we're going to transition into the question stage. So if anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat box or raise your hand, and we will proceed um, so that Dr. Olukwi can answer the questions. One of the questions says, for what I'm getting is that this idea of a global Black studies to be redundant, what of specificity of different understandings of race? Is that sort of a cop out?
Hi. I don't think it's redundant because if it was redundant, it would be doing the same thing. And I don't think that it's doing the same thing. I do think that Global Black Studies is doing a lot of different labor, a lot of work that is, as I was mentioning, work that can be very liberal, but that can also be dangerous. And in its dangerous aspect, can also reconnect, I would say, Black studies to that mission of investigating Western civilization, investigating the Black world, investigating the West as a project, not as a place. And that's a quote from Glissant. So I don't think that it's redundant. I do think that it speaks to the kind of particular historical moment that we are in, which is this double bind of the kind of like neoliberal academy, but also the kind of reinvigoration of fascisms everywhere. And this double bind of like compromisions, assimilation, but also like how do we struggle outside of accommodations. All that to say, I don't think that redundancy is what's happening, but I do think that it can be a way to make an inquiry very it can be a way to domesticate what I would say makes Black studies actually dangerous. But something else might happen. Again, I'm not super optimistic as a person, but I do think that people can do things with paradigms that they were not intended to do, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you so much. Any other questions? In the comment box, we have, a lot of amazings and thank you. And we really thank you so much for this amazing lecture for our People's General Assembly. Thank you for participating in MXGM's summer school. And if there are no other questions, after this amazing lecture we have, and someone else just shared a question. I'm still digesting what you shared today, but I'm curious about how, if one can make Black studies more dangerous, so to speak. And
There's also another question in the Q&A.
oh yes, and another question,
Um,
sorry, like within the confines of academia, added on to that recent question. And another question says, I do not consider myself a scholar, but I'm in school. I'm from Trinidad, Black and Indian. Can you recommend a scholar to start understanding better this topic? So those two questions.
yeah. The first question about like how if one can make Black studies more dangerous within the confine of the academy. I think if it's like the short answer is that if it is just within the confine of the academy, I don't think it can ever be dangerous. Because that's also like the kind of like work of liberalism. It's this constant absorption of the kind of critical element and critique feeding into a kind of regeneration of what we are criticizing. Um, and I think that's also what Stuart Hall, sorry, was trying to say about this relationship between modernism and postmodernism. I would say, like, like, I don't think that there are ways to be like prescriptive about like what should be done, but I also don't want to cop out from answering this question because I think it's an important question. I think there are important disagreements and debates happening within Black studies about what should be done. But I think a sure sign of what should not be done as a way to answer this question is the types of project, again, that are kind of reinvigorating, trying to like use Blackness as a way to reinvigorate the nation state or reinvigorate empire. Thinking about um, Blackness as this kind of like suturing elements, the suture of the wound for either a national body or for um, an empire, instead of thinking about precisely those points of fracture, articulation, disarticulation. Seriously. Okay. And there is another question if you want to read it, Jamil.
Oh, yes. Thank you. The other question is, I do not consider myself a scholar, but I am in school and I'm from Trinidad, Black and Indian. Could you recommend a scholar to start understanding better this topic?
Um, yeah, there are like many, many scholars. I would say like specific to like it depends what you're interested in, but like specific to the kind of like um history, the kind of like institutional history of trying to create a Black Studies department in Trinidad and in the other campuses of the University of the West Indies. I would say Fitzroy Andre Baptiste is a really good person to read. Um, thank you. And I would also say that to think about this question of the global and Black studies, and that's the like fourth part that I realized I would never have time to like get to. I think the people to read are the people who are trying to articulate a kind of like beyond the nation state articulation that is not just like one single grid of lecture, but an attempt to articulate things of Blackness beyond the nation state. And I'm thinking about this question, the work, the scholarship of the Institute of the Black World in Atlanta, the the whole book, the different essays in this book are on LibGen. But also I'm thinking about like Glissant and this question of thinking about the West as a project, not as a place. Brent Edwards that I mentioned earlier. I think everyone who's like engaging in like trying to understand what's happening in terms of like diaspora world should read Brent Edwards the misrecognitions of diaspora. The book is a practice of diaspora, but he has this concept of misrecognition. I think that's really, really important. And then, of course, Walter Rodney, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa is a classic, but also articulates a kind of supranational understanding. Oh, sorry. And yeah, the question of the um, Pan-African Commonwealth with Cedric Robinson is also, it's a short article. And I think it also gives some pointers to think about different scales that are not just this kind of national scale.
Thank you so much. Please, everybody, show your love for Dr. Chrystel in the chat. This
Can I
was
just say that
amazing.
the person who says 1619 project makes me think of that? You are right on point. I almost said it, but yeah, you're right on point. But not just that. I think so like there's like, the more like obvious and there's like different ways. Again, of like disciplining into the professional is also a way to do that. But we can go back to this at a different time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And please show your love for Dr. Christel in the chat. This was amazing. Thank you again. And now we're going to transition into our classes. The class Zoom room will open shortly. And thank you all for attending the General Assembly lecture. Of course, next week will be our last Sunday. So please return next week for our lecture by Dr. Orasami Burton. So we look forward to seeing you and enjoy classes today. Free the land.